For 200 years, the war between the Veltran Empire and the Zarkari Dominion had raged across the stars. It had begun over territory, one disputed planet, one ancient grudge. But now, it had become something else entirely. A cycle of destruction with no end. Entire worlds had been burned to ash. Fleets that once numbered in the thousands had been reduced to scattered wrecks drifting in space. Both sides had lost count of their dead. There were no more victories, only survival. And yet, neither side could stop. The galactic community had long since given up hope. The war had lasted for generations, outliving those who had first started it. Peace talks had been attempted 100 times, but neither the Veltran nor the Zarkari were willing to surrender. The Veltran, tall and silver-skinned, believed in discipline and honor. They saw the war as their sacred duty, to prove their strength, to ensure their people would never be dominated. The Zarkari, reptilian and massive, believed in conquest. To them, war was not a burden. It was their nature. The balance of power shifted constantly. One year, the Veltran would gain ground, pushing deep into Zarkari space. The next, the Zarkari would strike back, reclaiming lost territory with brutal force. But no matter how much blood was spilled, neither side could land a final blow. For the soldiers fighting on the front lines, the war had become meaningless. They no longer fought for victory. They fought because it was all they had ever known. Commander Joreth of the Veltran fleet stood aboard his battlecruiser, staring at the massive holographic map before him. It displayed the same battle lines that had existed for decades. His forces had won another skirmish today. But what did it matter? He had seen this before. He had fought in 100 battles that changed nothing. On the other side of the war, Warlord Krenzik of the Zarkari Dominion sat in his command chamber, his claws digging into the armrests of his throne. Reports of lost ships and fallen soldiers filled the air around him. He barely listened. It was all the same as yesterday and the day before. War was all he knew. War was all he would ever know. Neither leader could see a future beyond this war. And then something changed. A message arrived, one that made both Joreth and Krenzik pause for the first time in years. It was a transmission from a species that had never been part of the war, one that had been ignored for centuries. Humans. The message was short. We can end this war in one day. Joreth scoffed. Krenzik laughed. But deep inside, a strange feeling began to grow in both of them. A feeling they had not experienced in a very, very long time. Uncertainty. The message spread like wildfire across both factions. Veltran officers whispered in hushed voices, wondering if it was some kind of trick. Zarkari warriors sneered at the idea that some unknown species could do what they had failed to do for 2 centuries. But no one could ignore it. The humans had not been involved in the war. They had never sent ships to fight, never taken sides. As far as the Veltran and Zarkari were concerned, humans were nothing more than a minor race, one of many scattered throughout the galaxy. Too weak to be noticed, too unimportant to be considered a threat. And yet here they were, claiming they could end a war that had lasted 200 years. Joreth sat in his command chamber, staring at the transmission. The human who had sent it introduced himself as Admiral Grant. His voice was calm, steady, too confident for someone making such an absurd claim. Joreth's second-in-command, Captain Rinus, crossed his arms. "They must be insane," he muttered. "No species can end this war in a single day. Not even the ancients who once ruled the stars could have done such a thing." Joreth agreed. It was impossible. And yet, across the battlefield, in the heart of Zarkari space, Warlord Krenzik watched the same message, his clawed fingers tapping against the metal of his throne. His war council had already dismissed the humans as fools, but Krenzik did not laugh as they did. He had fought for decades. He had seen things others had not. He knew the impossible only seemed impossible until it was proven real. And so, despite their doubts, both sides agreed to meet the humans. A neutral space station, long abandoned by war, was chosen as the meeting ground. Veltran and Zarkari warships arrived first, their guns primed, their soldiers on edge. No one trusted the other. Then the humans arrived. A single fleet, much smaller than the forces gathered around them. Their ships were unassuming. They lacked the monstrous weapons of the Zarkari, the elegant war designs of the Veltran. They were functional, practical, almost basic. Jorith watched from his bridge, his sharp eyes analyzing every detail. "This is a joke," Rennis whispered. "They are nothing." Krenzek stood in his war chamber, watching the human fleet on his monitors. His generals growled in agreement. They'd bring only a handful of ships. They do not understand war. Then the humans hailed both fleets. Admiral Grant's face appeared on their screens. He was smiling. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth, relaxed. "I appreciate you coming. I know you don't believe me. That's understandable. But before we begin, let me ask you something." The war leaders said nothing. Grant leaned forward. "Are you tired?" The question caught them off guard. Jorith narrowed his eyes. "What kind of question is that?" Grant chuckled. "A simple one. You've fought for 200 years. You've killed millions. And yet, you're still here, still fighting a war that has no end. A war you don't even know how to win anymore. So I ask again, are you tired?" A long silence followed. On both sides of the war, officers glanced at one another. Soldiers who had spent their whole lives fighting clenched their fists. Because the answer, whether they admitted it or not, was yes. The war had taken everything from them. Their families, their homes, their futures. And for the first time, someone had asked if they wanted it to stop. But Jorith was a warrior. Krenzek was a conqueror. Neither would simply surrender because of a few words. Jorith spoke first. "Words do not win wars. Human, prove your claim." Krenzek bared his fangs. "Yes. Show us how you end what cannot be ended." Admiral Grant grinned. "Oh, I intend to." Then the human fleet moved. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment the human fleet moved, everything changed. Jorith watched from his command bridge, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. The human ships, small, unimpressive, seemingly weak, did not act like a typical battle force. They did not form defensive lines. They did not adjust formations in preparation for combat. They moved with purpose. Fast, precise, efficient. Warlord Krenzek growled, his claws tapping against the console in front of him. "What are they doing?" he snarled. His generals did not answer. They didn't know. Neither side had ever seen ships move like this before. In every war fought across the stars, battles had always followed a predictable pattern. Lines were drawn. Formations were set. Heavy ships stayed back, while smaller ones moved to engage. The humans ignored all of it. Their ships slipped between Veltran and Zarkari war formations like predators weaving through a herd of prey. Then, without warning, the first strike. A single human ship, no larger than a standard escort, suddenly accelerated. It was too fast. Veltran sensors struggled to track it. Zarkari weapon systems could not lock on. It shot past a Veltran battlecruiser, and then, boom. An explosion erupted, but not from weapons fire. The ship had hacked the battlecruiser's systems in less than 3 seconds. Every engine, every shield generator, every weapon shut down simultaneously. The massive warship, a vessel that had fought for decades, was now dead in space. Jorith shot to his feet. What? But before he could react, it happened again. Another ship disabled a Zarkari dreadnought in the same way. Then another, and another. Not a single shot had been fired. Warlord Krenzek's fangs bared in fury. How is this possible? The answer came from Admiral Grant himself, his voice calm over the open channel. Your war has lasted for 2 centuries because you fight the same way you always have. You build bigger ships, bigger guns, but war isn't just about weapons. He leaned forward, smiling. It's about control. Joreth gritted his teeth. "What are you doing?" Grant's eyes gleamed. "Winning." Within minutes, half the Veltran and Zarkari fleets had been disabled. No casualties, no destruction, just complete and total domination. It was then that both sides realized the truth. The humans were not here to fight a war. They were here to end it. Panic spread through the Veltran and Zarkari fleets like wildfire. For 200 years, war had been their only reality. They had fought, bled, and died for generations, believing no side would ever truly win. The idea of peace had become a distant, forgotten dream. And yet, in just minutes, the humans had crippled their fleets. Joreth's claws dug into his armrest as he watched ship after ship go dark. No weapons fired, no explosions, just control. The human ships moved like ghosts, silent, precise, unstoppable. Veltran battlecruisers and Zarkari dreadnoughts, once symbols of power, were now floating husks, powerless and dead in space. Warlord Krenzek slammed his fist against his console. Fight back. Launch the boarding crews. Override the systems. A desperate attempt. Joreth knew it would fail. The Veltran commander turned to his technicians. Is there a way to block their interference? The chief technician shook his head, his scales pale with fear. No, Supreme Commander. Their systems move too fast. They are inside our networks before we can react. It's like they see the battle before it even happens. Joreth growled in frustration. How could this be? The humans had no great empire, no history of conquest, no ancient war traditions. Yet, they fought like gods. A human voice cut through the chaos. Admiral Grant's voice. Calm, cold, final. Your war is over. Krenzek bared his fangs in fury. You have no right. This is not your war. You do not belong here. A pause. Then Grant spoke again, and his words sent a chill through every warrior listening. It wasn't your war either. Not at first, but you let it consume you. You let it define you. Joreth's hands tightened into fists. The human continued. We don't care who started it. We don't care why it lasted. But we will end it. And then, it got worse. The human fleet did not just disable ships. They hijacked them. Veltran warships turned against their own. Zarkari destroyers suddenly fired upon each other. The humans had gained complete control. Joreth's screen showed chaos. The Veltran forces were scattering, unsure who was friend or foe. The Zarkari were retreating. Retreat, a word that had never existed in their vocabulary. Yet now, there was no other choice. For the first time in 200 years, the war was no longer theirs to fight. The war had lasted for 2 centuries. 2 centuries of bloodshed, destruction, and endless battles. But now, in a matter of minutes, the battlefield had fallen into complete silence. Joreth had never felt fear before. Not like this. The Veltran's supreme commander stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the display screen in front of him. His fleet was gone. The warships that once stood as symbols of Veltran power were now motionless, hijacked by human forces. But it wasn't just the Veltran. Across the battlefield, the Zarkari forces were experiencing the same fate. Dreadnoughts, carriers, and destroyers, all useless. The humans had seized control without firing a single shot. The bridge of the Veltran flagship was eerily quiet. Joreth's crew, his best warriors, the most hardened fighters of his race, sat in stunned silence. Their hands hovered over controls they could no longer operate. They had always believed that even in defeat, they would go down fighting. But there was nothing left to fight with. On the main screen, Warlord Krenzek's face appeared. Even the Zarkari leader looked shaken. His red scales had darkened with stress, his massive fangs bared in frustration. What have you done? Krenzek snarled, his voice barely restrained. A soft chuckle came over the comms. Admiral Grant. What we had to. Joreth clenched his fists. You had no right to interfere in our war. This was between the Veltrin and the Zarkari. Was it? Grant's voice remained calm. 200 years ago, yes. But now, this war is bigger than both of you. How many species have suffered because of it? How many planets have been reduced to rubble? Joreth opened his mouth to argue, but he couldn't. They had both known, for a long time, that their war had become something beyond reason. It had started as a simple conflict over territory, resources, honor. But the hatred had festered. Generations were raised knowing nothing but war. Soldiers were born only to die on battlefields. Neither side had ever questioned it. Until now. Grant continued. You let the war define your civilizations. You let it consume your people. You would have fought for another century if no one stopped you. Krenzek let out a furious growl. You think we will simply surrender. You think you can control us. Grant sighed. We don't need to. Look around. The Veltrin and Zarkari commanders didn't need to. They could already see it. Across the battlefield, both fleets were falling apart. Veltrin warlords were abandoning their posts. Zarkari soldiers were defying orders. Some were trying to escape. Others were surrendering to the humans without a fight. The realization hit Joreth like a collapsing star. It wasn't just their ships that the humans had broken. It was the will to fight. For the first time in 200 years, warriors were choosing to lay down their arms. The war was crumbling from the inside. Joreth turned back to his screen, his chest heavy with the weight of the moment. He had fought in this war his entire life. His father had fought before him. His grandfather before that. He had always imagined dying on the battlefield. But never like this. Never in silence. Warlord Krenzek's voice cut through the quiet. You may have stopped us today, human, but wars do not end in a single battle. There was a pause. Then Grant's voice came again, soft but unshakable. No, but peace begins in one. The battlefield was silent. For the first time in 200 years, there was no gunfire, no explosions, no desperate cries of dying soldiers. The stars that had once been lit by endless war now burned quietly over the remains of what was once the greatest conflict in galactic history. Joreth stood on the bridge of his crippled warship, staring at the vastness of space. He still couldn't believe it. His fleet, his mighty Veltrin armada, was gone. Not destroyed, not captured. Just taken. The humans had done something impossible. They had ended the war without a final, glorious battle, without a victor standing over the ruins of the defeated. They had simply taken control. And now, as Joreth watched, the true horror unfolded before him. Across the battlefield, Veltrin warriors were abandoning their posts. Zarkari soldiers were laying down their weapons. Entire ships, ones that had fought for generations without surrender, were standing down. Joreth turned to his officers. Report. One of his lieutenants swallowed hard. The fleet is in chaos, Supreme Commander. Many are refusing to fight. Some of our warlords have already contacted the humans, asking for negotiations. Joreth clenched his fists. Traitors. They had been bred for war, raised in bloodshed. And yet, at the first sign of something they didn't understand, they crumbled. The Zarkari had fared no better. On the main screen, Warlord Krenzek's face appeared, the great leader of the Zarkari Empire, the one who had sworn to fight until the last warrior fell, looked shaken. This isn't over, Krenzek growled. But there was no fire in his voice, only doubt. Joreth understood his pain. The war was all they had ever known. Without it, what were they? A voice interrupted their thoughts. I'd say it's over. It was Admiral Grant, the human responsible for this disaster. Joreth turned to the screen, his voice filled with fury. You think this is victory? He gestured at the battlefield, at the thousands of ships now drifting without purpose. You have shattered everything. Our warriors, our leaders, our way of life. Grant's expression remained calm. No, Commander Joreth. We saved it. Joreth laughed bitterly. Saved. From what? From yourselves. For a moment, silence. Then, rage. Joreth slammed his fist onto the control panel. You humans don't understand. This war has been going on for centuries. You cannot simply stop it. Even if we lay down our weapons today, it will rise again tomorrow. This is who we are. Grant's eyes narrowed. No, Joreth. This is what you were made to be. There's a difference. Joreth glared at him. You think you can change us? No. Grant's voice softened. But you can. Joreth opened his mouth to argue. But the words died before they could leave his lips. Because, what if the human was right? He had always believed that the war defined them, that it was their destiny to fight. But what if it wasn't? What if there was another path? Joreth looked around the bridge. His officers were silent. Not defiant, not eager for revenge. Just lost. And in that moment, Joreth felt something he never had before. Fear. Not of the humans, not of defeat, but of the future, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The weight of 200 years of war hung heavy in the air. For centuries, battle had been their purpose, their destiny. But now, as Joreth stood on the bridge of his once mighty warship, he faced something far more terrifying than any enemy fleet. Peace. The humans had done the unthinkable. Not with overwhelming firepower, not with devastating weapons, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. The battlefield was silent. Across the stars, warships drifted aimlessly, their weapons cold. Veltran warriors and Zarkari soldiers, mortal enemies for generations, now stood together, unarmed, unsure of what to do next. It was over. Joreth clenched his fists. He had spent his entire life in battle, had risen through the ranks by sheer brutality and strategy. He had slaughtered Zarkari by the thousands, had crushed rebellions, had led glorious campaigns in the name of his people. And now it meant nothing. On the main screen, the human admiral, Grant, watched him with a calm, knowing expression. You still don't believe it, do you? Grant said. Joreth's voice was a growl. This war was everything. Grant nodded. I know, and that's why we had to end it. Joreth let out a bitter laugh. You think you've saved us. You've taken away our purpose, our warriors, our leaders, our very way of life. Grant folded his arms. Your way of life was slaughter, endless bloodshed. You think that's a legacy worth keeping? Joreth's jaw tightened. You don't understand. You humans, your history is short. Our people have fought for centuries. You don't just erase that overnight. Grant leaned forward. No, you don't, but you can choose something else. Joreth turned away, his mind racing. Could they? Behind him, his officers stood in silence. These were warriors who had followed him into countless battles, who had sworn to fight until their last breath. But now, their faces were filled with doubt. They were warriors without a war. And Joreth knew exactly what that meant. Rebellions, mutiny, entire fleets refusing to accept this unnatural peace. His people wouldn't just surrender to a new way of life overnight. There would be chaos, destruction, maybe even civil war. He turned back to Grant, his voice sharp. You think this is over? You think we'll all just accept this? Grant's eyes didn't waver. Some won't. Some will fight. But you. His voice softened. You have a choice, Joreth. You can either lead your people into the future, or let them burn in the past. Joreth felt a deep, twisting anger in his chest. How dare this human put that weight on him? But as he looked back at his officers, at the faces of warriors who no longer knew what they were fighting for, he knew the truth. He already carried that weight. The war was over, whether he wanted it to be or not. And now, he had to decide what came next. Joreth took a slow breath. Then, for the first time in his life, he gave an order that wasn't about war. All Veltran forces, stand down. The words felt foreign on his tongue. The bridge was silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, one by one, his officers obeyed. Across the stars, Veltran warships powered down their weapons. A moment later, the Zarkari followed. It was over. Truly over. Joreth turned back to Grant. I hope you're right about this, human. Grant gave a small, tired smile. So do I. For the first time in 200 years, the galaxy was at peace, and no one knew what would happen next.